Can we please recite a Surah Al-Fatiha for the following marhumeen? Sayyid Ali Hadi Jafri ibn Sayyid Saftar Hassan Jafri, Sayyid Sardar Hassan Jafri, Sayyid Muhammad Hamid Jafri, Habiba Khatun Rizvi, and all the marhumeen and marhumat of everybody else, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا وشفيع ذنوبنا أبو الزهراء المصطفى أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. ثم الصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين ولعنة الله الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله عز وجل في كتابه المبين وهو أصدق القائلين: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. التائبون العابدون الحامدون السائحون الراكعون الساجدون الآمرون بالمعروف والناهون عن المنكر والحافظون لحدود الله وبشر المؤمنين. آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. As today is the final day that I'm in essence amongst your good presence, I would like to take this opportunity also to thank you, Maulana, first and foremost, and the rest of the community here for inviting a nobody like me to come and sit and spend the past few days and commemorate with you what is the greatest tragedy on the face of this earth that the stars and the moon and the sun has ever seen. I thank you all for your kind welcome and your forbearance with my inadequate and incomplete deliverance of what is required from this member. So I apologize for my weakness and I ask for your forgiveness in my shortcomings, and inshallah I know that you are a very gracious community from what I've seen, alhamdulillah, and from what I heard from Maulana about your good selves. And inshallah, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills it so and finds me worthy of being here once again, inshallah, that will indeed happen. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajjal farajahum. Yesterday we arrived at the conclusive point from this topic or mini-series that we've embarked upon, which we have named and directed as being, why are we the way we are? What makes us the way we actually are? What has resulted in us being the people or the personalities or the characters or the characteristic traits that we possess? And we came to the conclusion yesterday that indeed nature and nurture play an influential role in what we actually become, but there is another factor, a huge factor, in fact the most important factor, which overrides both whatever the nature and the nurture has made its effect upon us, and has the ability to direct us towards what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to achieve. And we said that is the perfection and the power of the nafs. We defined the nafs and we said that the nafs is in essence Very difficult to define with one word with regards to the English language, but we gave it the term of the self, we gave it the term of the ego, we gave it the term of the soul. We also said it's who we are right now. That is the state of our nafs. And within which the important aspect of this nafs is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed something within this nafs which is in fact the most important aspect of this nafs, which is freedom or free will. The ability to actually choose and direct where we want ourselves to actually be. If we don't understand this concept of freedom or free will, we can never understand who we actually are and why we actually are the way we are. We said very clearly, and we proved that yesterday, that nature and nurture we have no control over necessarily for ourselves. Yes, we do have an input with regards to our children and our future generations, but with regards to our own self, the only thing that we have is the control and the perfection of our own self, and molding and directing it to a particular direction. But before we can do that, we have to understand what this nafs actually is. And the essential component of this nafs is the concept of freedom. If we understand freedom and how it pertains to our nafs, we will in fact understand the nafs, or begin the journey of understanding the nafs. Yesterday I mentioned, we never, in any institute, especially in the Western world, get taught about ourselves. We get taught about everything that surrounds us, geography, geology, geometry, and any other science that starts with the letter G. We get taught it. But when it comes to our own self, there is nobody that teaches us about who we actually are, what we actually are. In other words, we never start the journey to discovering the self. And hence the reason why we never truly end up discovering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I gave you that, recited in front of you that beautiful hadith from both the Holy Prophet and Amir al-Mu'mineen. Let's have a loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala Muhammad wa ajjal farajah. In which both have stated, Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbah. The one who understands his nafs in turn will understand his Lord. So the first step towards understanding the nafs is understanding what governs the nafs. What is the essential component of the nafs? And we discover and we will see that it is the freedom within the nafs, the free will that allows us to choose where we direct that nafs to. As we saw examples of the children of Prophet Adam and our mother Eve, having two children, nature and nurture being exactly the same, but one decides to direct through free will and freedom of choice to one particular direction, and the other one to another. So this concept of freedom is essentially paramount in knowing why we are the way we are. Let's have one loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. I've had the honor and the pleasure of reciting today's majalis and starting with a beautiful verse of chapter number 9, Surah Tawbah, verse 112, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most gracious and the most merciful, addresses us and says, those who return in repentance to Allah. When we say at-ta'ibun, those who repent or return to Allah, those who worship Allah, and those who praise Allah, and those who travel with such aims as conveying Allah's message, or study and make investigations for Allah's sake, or reflect on Allah's signs, and those who bow down in awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and those who prostrate, ar-raqi'un, as-sajidun, and those who prostrate themselves before Allah in submission, and those who enjoin and promote that which is good and right, and forbid that which is bad and evil. Amirun bil ma'ruf wa anhaun min al munkar. And those who keep, this is the important point, and those who keep to the bounds set by Allah, hudud Allah. Those who keep to the boundaries set by Allah, then give them the glad tidings to those who believe. After saying all of these things, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ends by saying, after having done all of these things, the believers are those who are bound to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned as the boundary by which we operate. They are the believers, and they are the ones that you should, O dear Prophet, convey the glad tidings and the good news to. Inshallah, we will understand this by the end of this evening's majalis, inshallah. So what we have come to and what we have understood is this, that the gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given each and every one of us is indeed life, but within this life, the real gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given insan is freedom. Remember, there are malaika, there are angels, but they don't have this free will to choose between right and wrong. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands and they fulfill. Whereas you and I, we've been blessed with this choice of having this freedom to direct our lives wherever we want. And we've said very clearly the characteristics, the traits, the properties that we have inherited from our parents, in other words, nature, and also the nurturing aspects, can all be overridden based on the freedom of choice that resides within the nafs. So, the aspect that we are talking about, like I said, is freedom. And this is what I want us to understand today. What I'm going to be essentially talking about is what freedom actually is. And number two, what is freedom divided into? In other words, what is freedom composed of? And we will find, and inshallah we will discover and outline, that freedom is in fact composed of two aspects. Social freedom, which we tend only and only to hear about, especially with the American history of slavery. Social freedom. And the second aspect which makes up freedom, spiritual freedom, which we never hear about. And how both are interrelated and how, in essence, they govern who we actually are. Let us first and foremost try and understand what is meant by freedom. The definition of freedom, in essence, is this, before we go into its aspects. If we look at what freedom actually is, we find that freedom is essential. Never mind human beings, it's also essential and inherent within animals. In fact, it even pervades into the plant kingdom. Plants, animals, and even human beings essentially have to have the component of freedom to be able to exist and do what they need to do. So, the first aspect is that it's necessary for anything that is living to have this freedom. The second thing, that it is inherently a natural disposition of human beings, animals, and plants. How do we know that we have this freedom? Well, in everything that we do, we see that we are actually expressing and manifesting freedom. For example, when I say, I want this, or I say, I don't want that, that is an expression of the fact that I'm exercising this freedom that I have. The irada that I have, the intention that I have, that I want to do this or I don't want to do that, shows that the want, that the word want, is in essence an expression of this freedom. The fact that I extend my hand, for example, to pick up a glass of water, is an expression of the freedom that I choose to drink this particular water. I'm thirsty, and I'm sure you've all had this. Imagine you go through a day, extremely hot day. All day you've been working, you've been looking for an opportunity to drink a sip of water, but you haven't had an opportunity. You haven't had a break, your lunch, something's kept you occupied. So you've worked the whole day, but you haven't had the ability to drink even one sip of water. You drive home, you come home, the first thing that you want to do is throw your bag and move towards the kitchen or wherever that you can get some water from. Imagine then that you open the tap, you fill that glass of water, and you drink or are about to drink that water. And something comes in place, stops your hand from moving towards your mouth. Your intention, your freedom to drink that water, which is something that you've wanted, has now been hampered, has been restricted. What happens? The human being will do absolutely anything to override the hindrance, thank you, the barrier, the hindrance, to overcome that freedom that's been violated. Because insan loves freedom. You can take everything else away from a human being, but if you violate his freedom, he will react. The human being will do absolutely everything to overcome that restricting factor to drink that water. And you can see that. What we are essentially talking about here is social freedom. Anything that externally restricts our movement to a particular aspect is an expression of our freedom. Anything that restricts that, we will try to overcome. But that is related, like I said, to social freedom. Please recite one loud salawat. So if we have understood social freedom from what governs my intentions to do something, what I want to achieve, if we take that social freedom, we will understand what the parameter of freedom, what the outskirts of freedom is. That is the external part of what freedom is defined as. The core of freedom, the actual heart of freedom, is spiritual freedom. And this is governed by other than the body. And inshallah, we will look into that. So, when we have come to the understanding of social freedom being everything that governs the body and surrounds the body or hampers or restricts the body, we think of, for example, slavery. We, especially living here in the US, have seen the manifestations and the effects of when mankind has been suppressed and restricted. We spoke about, for example, individuals, especially from the Afro-Caribbean community, who came here in bondage and was subjected and used as a piece of wood is, or a stone is, or an animal is. And we saw the violations against mankind, fellow human beings, and how the world became in a state of uproar with regards to it. And even till today, it's seen as a black spot, a dark past of American history. But that, again, is one aspect, like I said, the external part of what freedom is. The internal part, which is relevant to us, and in fact not just us, but every human being, is the spiritual freedom that we really need to come and overcome and understand to be able to liberate ourselves, to understand why we are the way we are. Please recite one loud salawat. So to begin with, let me give you some examples just so that we understand. Every single one of us here, we all realize one thing: we all need food. And we say that with the food, the more variety of food that there is, the better it is, right? We also come to clothing and we say that we all need clothing. And we say that the finer the clothing, and again, the more better the quality, and again, the greater the variety of this clothing is, the better that would be. We would also agree and say, with regards to our homes, that we all need homes. We need shelter. And the greater these houses are, the more luxurious these houses are, the better. Nothing wrong with that. Islam is not one of those religions that teaches us that we should not be able to possess what this world has to offer. Like Imam Jafar as-Sadiq alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Imam states, he says, when it comes to asceticism is zuhud or zahid, the one who abstains from the world. The Imam says that az-zuhud laysa an la tamlik shay. Being a zahid, being somebody who is removed from the world, does not mean that you don't possess what this world has to offer. It doesn't mean that you don't possess anything. Bal huwa an la yamlikuka shay. But in fact, being a zahid, being an ascetic, is somebody who is not owned by the possessions. Very subtle difference, but very huge in meaning. Zuhud is not that you don't own anything, it's that nothing owns you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created you and I, and created everything for our sake, for us to utilize in a prescribed manner, in a hudud, in a had, in a boundary, with particular restrictions for our benefit. He's created every single thing for us, but He's created you and I for Him. And we have this in many hadith from the Holy Prophet, Hadith al-Qudsi, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling His beloved Prophet that I've created every single thing for the children of Adam, but I've created them for me. It's understanding this aspect where we get to choose to follow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the greatest gift. How gracious is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He hasn't compelled us to be in His obedience, but given us the freedom to choose to be in His obedience. Why? Because we see and we come to the understanding that it's in our benefit to do so. Please recite one loud salawat. So alongside clothing, alongside food, alongside dwellings, alongside spouses, alongside children, we like all of these things in our life. And like I said, there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is this: there comes a time when having better food and having better clothing and having better homes is presented in front of us with a transaction that we need to make. And what I mean by that is this: our honor, our dignity, and our nobility is put in front of us and said, I'll give you better food, I'll give you better homes and better clothes and better materialistic wealth, but you have to compromise on your dignity, on your honor, on your nobility. This is where certain people will say, no. I can happily and readily accept bread and water. I can readily accept shabby clothes. I can readily accept sleeping rough. But my nobility and my dignity and my honor, I can't sell that. I can't compromise that. So they will preserve that, even if it means a detriment with regards to these aspects of life. And we know this. And we know people like this. There are on the other hand, people who will readily accept and say, my dignity, my nobility, and my honor counts for nothing. Give me the better food, give me the better home, give me the better clothes, and give me the better lifestyle in this world, and I'm happy to make that transaction. But what's the difference? What we find is that one of these individuals who is happy to sell for merely better clothing and better food and better, more luxurious homes is in fact enslaved to these things. And the one who doesn't has in fact said, actually no, these are materialistic possessions, these are comforts of this world, they should not be the means by which I compromise who I actually am for these sake, for their sake, and so refuses and takes on these hardships and says, my dignity, my honor, and my respect for myself is far greater than these things. That choice is there. It's a freedom. You have the opportunity to either choose one or the other. And what we are in essence talking about is the lower animalistic self and the higher spiritual self. One aspect, because the nafs is a composition, it has the ability to be as low and basic and driven by animalistic desires, and it has the ability to be even higher than angels. Like where we hear again from the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad wa ajjal farajahum. We hear that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the Holy Prophet, that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created animals, He placed within them simply the desire and want. All types of desires, He placed them within the animals, without any intelligence. When He created the angels, He placed pure intelligence with no desire. But when He made you and me, He placed within us both aspects. He placed within us the desire and the hunger towards that animalistic desire of food and clothing and drink and shelter and procreation, and also placed within us the faculty of the aql, intelligence. And He left the freedom to us to choose whichever way we wanted to go. Do we choose the freedom which allows us to be worse than animals and be led by our desires and compromise and sell everything that we are based on that? In other words, food and drink is what I desire, and I will be readily and happy to transact on that basis. Or do I let my life be directed by my aql, and which will lead me to what my true purpose and intention in this world actually is? And the choice is before us. Simplified, let me relate to you a story of two brothers. These two brothers, one of these brothers was very wealthy. He was rich, comfortable. He worked for a corrupt government. He had a very nice house. He had a very nice lifestyle. The other brother was not as rich. In fact, he was poor. But this other brother worked in a manual fashion. He was a laborer. He worked with his hands, and his life was pretty difficult. One day the rich brother says to the poorer brother, and he says to him, why don't you accept this government service and be delivered from the hardships and the distresses that you face on a daily basis? He says this to the poorer brother. The poorer brother replies, and this is worthy of note, he says to him, that this kind of service that you are asking me to take on board, which you have taken and accepted, why don't you work and be delivered from this submission and slavery and subservience? In other words, you've sold yourself to this corrupt government and you've worked for them. But you've compromised what? Yourself, your dignity, your pride, your status, your honor. For what? A better home? Better clothing? Better food? That is also, and actually, the real sense of the slavery that we need to come to understand. Yes, we have got rid of social slavery. Zahiriyan, on the apparency, we don't have bondage of the body. We've got rid of that. But the spiritual slavery of the mind and of the heart and of the nafs still continues even till today. Please recite aloud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The point being, my dear brothers and sisters, is this: that this kind of service which accompanies compromising on wealth based on achieving material possessions compromises the basis that we were created for. Remember on the day of Ashura, remember the words of Imam al-Hussein. What does he say? He says, I swear by Almighty Allah, I shall not surrender as a humiliated person, and I shall not escape like a slave. And furthermore, goes on to say that I would rather die on my feet than to live on my knees. What was Imam al-Hussein actually talking about? You see, the real message of Imam al-Hussein was to take us from standing or living or existing on our knees and allowing us to stand back onto our feet. In other words, he did not compromise his honor, his dignity, and his true freedom in this life for the material possessions. And yet we see people like Shimr and Ibn Ziyad desperate for what this world had to offer. The land of Ray was put forward, presented. We will give you land and money and wealth. The reason why the people of Kufa, after inviting Imam al-Hussein, turned, and the vast majority turned, was because they were able to be bought by what? Food, clothing, homes, land, their lives. This is the real essence about knowing and who you actually are, is the fact that you've been given this gift of freedom to choose whichever way you want your life to be directed. Imam al-Hussein sacrificed himself so that we could no longer be enslaved. I'm not talking about the physical slavery. I'm talking about the slavery of the mind, the heart, and of the self. Please recite one loud salawat. So what is it that makes a human being prefer pain, hardship, labor, poverty, and even accept death rather than be humiliated in the subservience of the life of others? I believe the answer is in a statement by Amir al-Mu'mineen, in which he states, Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Amir al-Mu'mineen states and makes a beautiful statement. He says, if you desire to live freely, he's addressing you and I. If you desire to live freely, then labor like a slave, work like a slave. Work and suffer and take upon yourselves pain and shut your eyes off from the offerings of Adam's offspring, even if they be Hatim al-Ta'i. Remember we mentioned Hatim al-Ta'i yesterday? Hatim al-Ta'i was an individual who was extremely generous. The Imam here is saying very straightforwardly, he's saying, kill your expectations. Never mind of those who don't want to give you anything or don't want to provide you anything. Even kill your expectations of those people that are rich and generous and can provide you with something. And then Amir al-Mu'mineen says these beautiful words, which again summarize and give us a realization of how important this concept of freedom is. He says, it may well be that you are in need. And we are in need because we said freedom is all about, I want this. That's the expression. Imam says, there's no doubt you will be in need. It may well be that you are in need of something. But remember that if you are in need of someone, you are also in essence turning yourself into his or her slave. But if you do away with that need, you say, I don't want that need anymore. You do away with it. Then what happens is you become that person's equal because you don't need anything from them. Then Imam says, but if you then become the person who provides the needs of others, you are in essence becoming their master. In other words, Imam is showing us the three different levels that this life is all about. If you are in need, if you are enslaved by your needs, and they can be of any type, especially materialistic, then what are we doing? We are placing ourselves in the subservience of others. If we are doing away with those needs, we are making ourselves equal to others. If we then become ourselves the ones who provide that need, then we are becoming the ones who are becoming the masters. This in essence is a real direction in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to take us. You see, when you're in need, you're giving your own self up to others. There's a great rank and a great honor for those who are independent. There's a great rank and a great honor for those who are self-sufficient. Islam promotes individuals like that. It's a good way to be. Please recite one loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So the summary of the message that I'm trying to get so far is this, and bear with me, I'm trying to take you somewhere, is this: quit slavery by quitting your needs. If you get rid of your needs, you're no longer able to be enslaved, and become masters by providing for the needs of others. In essence, what we are saying is this, that is there a type of slavery? And what type of slavery is it that we are talking about here? Is the slavery of the spirit. And this is what I want us to come to. Amir al-Mu'mineen, with reference to the physical slavery and the spiritual slavery, says this: the one who is overtaken, subdued and conquered and enslaved by his desires has become more disgraced than the one who is owned as a slave. Allahu Akbar. In other words, if you have become enslaved by your animalistic nafs, then you have less dignity, by the words of the Imam, than somebody who's physically in bondage. We have, like I said, got rid of physical bondage, but we are still enslaved to our desires. Please recite one loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajal farajah. Amir al-Mu'mineen also goes on and says, greed is a means of perpetual slavery. And he considers greed worse than slavery. And how many have got rid of that type of enslavement? Spiritual slavery is mentioned as being worse than physical slavery. Now the human being is a complex being, you know. There are various powers and instincts, strengths and appetites, greeds and wants that direct him to being who he actually is. The essential question being asked is, can a human being be socially free, have social freedom, in other words physical freedom, without having spiritual freedom? If somebody is physically free, can they have spiritual freedom? In other words, what I'm trying to say here is, can they be also slaves to themselves? Of course they can. We have seen in human beings, with regards to the history And you can ask any ancient history that have enslaved people, whether it's the Egyptians or the Romans or the British or otherwise, the Americans. Why is it that one type of person enslaves another type of person? It's because they haven't become spiritually free. They see another human being as a commodity. The people that enslaved the American black community, they enslaved them based on what? They enslaved them based on the fact that they regarded themselves as physically free and these individuals as being physically bound. They were physically free people. They were socially free people, were the people that were enslaving the black community. But the problem was that they hadn't come to the realization of spiritual freedom. Hence the reason why they abused them. Has anything changed? Nothing's changed. The context has changed. Slavery still exists till today. The fact that we have got rid of the physical bonds and the chains, that's one aspect of it. But truly, have we liberated the human beings that exist even in the US and stopped them from being slaves to their wants and desires? No, we haven't. All we see is consumption of product. Commercialism is the slavery that still exists. Every single person that you look around in the society around us is working to what? A better house, a bigger car, competing, as we say in England, is with the Joneses, right? With your neighbors, trying to keep up. That is what is still absorbing us and directing our lives towards. Making sure that we stay up to date with our latest cars and clothes and homes and foods and everything else. So we haven't really changed the concept of slavery. We've just redefined the definition. We're still enslaved. Physical bondage, like Amir al-Mu'mineen is saying, is not as humiliating as being enslaved by the self. When we look at freedom, when we understand freedom, what do we see? Freedom is something becoming unattached or breaking away from something else. Social freedom is a physical break away from somebody else's enslavement. Physical inbounding, where others are enslaving us, that's social freedom. What is spiritual enslavement? It's the enslavery of the self. When you become free from the self, you're detaching yourself from yourself. So before we should talk about becoming liberated by others, we should become liberated from ourselves, right? Shouldn't that be the core of where we should start the journey from? We still today hold banners and marches and demonstrations against any type of physical enslavery. We react so suddenly and so aggressively, but when we look at ourselves, we find ourselves in such a weak state that we haven't even liberated ourselves from ourselves. We're still looking at the external and haven't focused within our own enslavement. Please recite aloud salawat. So it is indeed the schooling of divinely appointed, infallible individuals that have come to this earth that teaches how we first and foremost become liberated and free from ourselves. And then come and teach us about freedom from bondage. Remember, people say about the Muslims, right? Your history as Muslims, we didn't see Muhammad and we didn't see your infallible teachers come and say on day one, stop slavery. In fact, we hear about them having slaves also. They point that finger at us, right? And they say, how come you as Muslims, you talk about freedom and how slavery is bad, but your own history is painted with that paint of slavery. The whole point of this aspect, which is really important, is this. When the divine messengers and the divine guides have come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they don't concentrate first and foremost on the external. They concentrate on what is most important. It doesn't make a difference if you are physically inbound, as long as you are spiritually free. Remember, we have this concept of people being in jail, right? And people say, yes, you can physically place me in a jail, but you haven't locked my mind or my heart or my spirit away. It's still free. We spoke about Malcolm X yesterday, right? What did we say about Malcolm? Did Malcolm find true spiritual freedom while he was a free man? Or was it when he went into jail that it was liberated and became a free man? It's so unusual, right? When he had the physical freedom of the world, he was enslaved to it. But when he was confined in a small space, he found the liberation of the true self and truly became a free man. Why? He realized that the physical embodiment of the slavery, what's going outside, yes, we may be free externally, but it's not until we understand the freedom from ourselves that we truly understand freedom. And this is what the divine message came with, about liberating ourselves from ourselves. Once you become alive and free within yourselves, you will automatically get rid of the shackles of the world. And you will see, in fact, it was Islam that gave freedom not only internally, but externally. Do you know what got rid of the concept of slavery even from the time of Jahiliyyah? And when the Prophet came, Islam did. The reason was, on every action, there was a freeing of a slave. If you didn't fast, kafara was, free a slave. If you'd done something wrong, if there was any good deed that you wanted to do on the day of Eid or other than that, free a slave. There was this constant means of freeing them. But why didn't Islam come and free them straight away? And say, abolish freedom, slavery straight away? It is because Islam understood that it's not as black and white as you may see. There were people, human beings, that didn't have the means to provide for themselves. So they were in slavery, in the Islamic concept, employment, not slavery. Where the Imams were educating them, feeding and providing for them, because they didn't know how to look after themselves. They didn't know how to work and earn. And if they were said, if freedom came in the physical sense straight away, people would have died of starvation. So it's a mercy on the initial stages. Like a child, you've got to educate a child for it to understand and develop the skills to be independent. If you say, no, there's no sense of dependency in Islam, and you have to from day one be free, that's not fair. You'll kill the child. It needs to be raised to a point where it understands its true independence and liberates itself truly and becomes a separate entity. The reason why there's no slavery now in the Middle East and in the world over is essentially because of Islam. Please recite aloud salawat. So the world today talks about freedom and says we truly have achieved freedom, especially in this country, right? Because this country is one of the major flag bearers of freedom, right? Supposedly. The Western freedom and democracy, and even in France, right? Liberty, freedom, and dignity. Yeah? But really, if freedom only means not being enslaved, yet our minds and our hearts and our nafs and our self is still embroiled in slavery till today, the message of the Holy Prophet, the message of Imam al-Hussein still hasn't been realized. You see how far we are? We are still looking at the external aspects and saying, we are free. No, we're not. We're only free when we liberate ourselves from ourselves. Spiritual freedom is the reason and the basis by which a human being starts the journey towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's when you're truly a free man that you won't compromise when it comes to your faith. You won't shy away of being identified as a Muslim. You'll stand up and be proud because you understand it's the truth. You won't feel embarrassed because other people have an opinion about what Islam is. You won't be one of those individuals to make that extra buck and compromise that to fill your own pocket. You're a free man. And that's what Islam wants. That you're not enslaved to anything. You know the boundaries of Allah, and that's the only thing that you're concerned with. Please recite aloud salawat. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created each and every one of us with this basis of freedom. The body, like I said yesterday, we are also bound, imprisoned in this body right now. There's a period of time that we're living through right now where we're a spirit locked into a body. Does that mean then that I'm bound to this world? No. My mind should be liberated to the point where my mind should remain where I'm meant to be, where I came from. There's a famous poem, and it summarizes absolutely everything that I'm trying to say here. The poet says, "Keep your head as high as the seventh heaven. Keep your head as high as the seventh heaven, for that is where you came from, were made and will return in essence. Attached to this is your figure of 8. Attached to this head is your figure of 8, fashioned on this earth to supplicate. Rooted to this are your 2 feet, which should remain 6 feet deep, reminding you of your transitory retreat." If we look at these numbers together, 7th heaven, figure of 8, and 6 feet deep. 7, 8, 6. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Please recite aloud salawat. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So we have to understand our aspect that we were created for something else. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed within you and me something called the ruh, the spirit. And it's not that we have to understand what the spirit is in detail, because we can't. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says it in the Quran. When they ask you regarding the ruh, say it's from one of the commands of Allah. But what is important is this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in chapter 15, verse 29. Remember, we are on a journey to finding out why we are the way we are. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِذَا سَوَّيْتُهُ وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي فَقَعُوا لَهُ السَّاجِدِينَ. So when I have shaped him, and then I breathe into him of my own spirit, I want you to fall down, bowing, prostrating towards him. Adam, our forefather, alayhi salam, was a body. Did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ask every single angel to bow down to him when he was a body? No, he didn't. The body has no value. He says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, when I breathe into him of my spirit, that's when you need to bow down to him. In other words, the value that you and I have isn't in the body, but in the spirit. And this is where Shaitan, Iblis, unfortunately for him, messed up. He was concerned with the material aspect of he's made from clay and I'm made from fire. What he didn't realize, what he should have realized, the thought process of, one second, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not told me to bow down to him when he's made him in the physical form. He said to me, bow down to him when I blow into him of my spirit. In other words, even if we take that argument about you created me from fire and him from clay, he should have actually said, you created me from fire, but him from spirit. Now you tell me, brothers and sisters, what is higher? Spirit or fire? The spirit is a higher, more refined fabric. The fire is a physical element. The spirit is metaphysical. Fire is natural. The spirit is supernatural. You see where his logic failed him? Because he was looking on the zahir, the external. He was enslaved by the physical. He did not understand the spiritual freedom. Please recite one loud salawat. So my dear brothers and sisters, this world that we are in right now, where this beautiful thing that we have within us, which is actually from the commands of Allah, you and I have a aspect of us that is so refined, which is our spirit, which comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is what makes us who we actually are. The problem is, we haven't connected with it. We haven't associated ourselves with it. We still see ourselves as a physical body. And hence the reason why we're enslaved by it. Hence the reason why we still haven't understood the message truly of Imam al-Hussein. Why we still haven't been liberated and haven't gone from living on our knees to standing up and accepting death on our feet. If we are able to overcome our passions, that's when we truly become free. If we conquer our lusts, that's when we become free. If you're in a position to gain an illegitimate dollar, but you refuse it, that's when you're free. If you still find yourselves lustful, or in a place where when you see the opposite gender, and you see within yourselves a reaction that directs you towards that, and your body parts leading your spirit towards that, you're still not free. But if you're able to overcome that and say, no, my spirit is what governs me, not my body. And you stop yourselves from being dragged towards the opposite gender and hold on to who you actually are. That's when you're free. But if you're not, what are you a slave to? You're a slave to your taste buds. You're a slave to your touch. You're a slave to your eyes and your ears and your smell. In fact, we talked about this yesterday when we mentioned how shallow it is to live this life based on only the five senses. We said this, that anybody who lives their life bound by these five senses hasn't actually realized what life is actually about. Because there is so much of the unseen which yet has to be discovered. The spirit, is it something that's seen? No, it's not. In fact, jinn, are they seen? No, they're not. In fact, malaika, are they seen? No, they're not. Heaven and hell, are they visualized? No, they're not. In fact, if we go further than that and we just say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is Akbar, Allahu Akbar we say, right? Is Allah seen? No, He's not. So from that point of view, we've come to the conclusion, the unseen is far greater than the seen. The measurable physically is limited. The unlimited is the unseen. Please recite one loud salawat. So the program that the Anbiya and the Awliya and the A'imma came with was purification of this nafs, which is bound between spirit and body. Very quick definition. We are right now composed of three different things. We have certain people in this world that see us, and no disrespect to any medical doctor, but I'm giving you an example. I come from the medical field myself. We are judged, valued, and treated as physical bodies. That's how people view us. That's how we are treated. If you have an illness, even if that illness is psychological, we'll still be treated as a physical entity. We have this other extreme, which is we are purely spiritual. So when you go to individuals like that, they will write for you a taweez, and they'll write for you a surah and say, please blow this on yourself. And I've got a physical ailment. I need something physical. What's this going to do? That perspective is also wrong, and so is this. In this life, we are a body which pre-existed as a spirit, and within that is the existence of the nafs. What do we mean? The body is what was created when we see Adam. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places within this body the spirit that was blown in, we now have body and spirit. But when the spirit and body come together, that's when the nafs or the soul comes into existence. Sometimes we confuse soul and spirit. Soul is nafs, spirit is ruh. The body is the jism, badan. So when the body and the spirit come together, that's when the nafs comes into existence. That's when the soul comes into existence. Now this nafs can either attach itself to the spirit and become refined, or it can attach itself to the body and become disgraced. That's the freedom we have in this world. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants this nafs to attach itself to the divine spirit that He blew into us. And not this physical body which is bound and a jail while we're in this world. Please recite one loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Hence the reason why this verse is so important. And the message was about purification of this nafs, perfection of it. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Shams, chapter number 91, verses 9 and 10. I recited this yesterday, but now I want you to see it with this perspective that we have today. Prosperous, successful is the one who purifies the nafs, the self. And failed is he who has corrupted it and been seduced by it. That's the real dilemma in this world. That's the real choice in this world. And if we haven't worked towards that, the whole purpose for why the Anbiya and the Ahlul Bayt came and they were left as two weighty things of Quran and Ahlul Bayt was that we understood and took from them so that we would be liberated from the material to the spiritual, from the natural to the supernatural, from the physical to the metaphysical. This is where, my dear brothers and sisters, we now understand that the real aspect of life, the real battle in this life is the jihad bin nafs. You know this, right? That's why it's called Jihadul Akbar. You all know the station where the Prophet talks about coming back from this major battle and says, you've left the minor battle, the minor struggle, the minor jihad. What awaits you is the greater one. And the companion's like, Ya Rasulullah, we've just given our lives. We've seen brothers that who have been part and parcel of Islam give their lives. They've killed. We've put our lives on the line. We've killed and we have been killed. And you're saying that's the minor struggle? That's the minor battle? And there's a greater battle yet? Yes. Of the self. This was this battle of these small group of people that have liberated themselves with the hope of liberating you and I. And they say this, right? We hear this. They say that the life is a battle and the world is the battlefield, right? You've heard that expression. Life's a battle and the world's the battlefield. I would actually say no. Indeed, truly it is that life is the battle, but it's the self that's the battlefield. That's where the real battle needs to take place, not outside, but within. The spiritual freedom that needs to be won and gained. And this is where, my dear brothers and sisters, we come to an understanding where we realize that there was an individual. And Islam does not, you can be imprisoned in this world, right? It's not that difficult. You can be bound in this world. You can be imprisoned. In fact, if we look at the history of the infallibles, the first bound individual, the one who was chained from head to foot, a yoke around his neck, his hands barred, his feet barred, was none other than Imam as-Sajjad alayhi salam. Physically bound indeed, but spiritually completely free. Free in mind, free in heart, free in spirit, and even free in body. He wasn't under the enslavement of his body. His body was under the enslavement, because even while he's walking, he's reciting namaz. Even while he's walking, the body is still subject to him. Yes, physically he may not be able to move to the same extent, but it's still under his command, because he's spiritually free. And it's not just Imam as-Sajjad. You see, Imam as-Sajjad, on one hand, we see and we realize, indeed, and we're looking at and trying to amalgamate everything that we've done so far. If we take again nature and nurture, the genealogy and the hereditary genes of Imam as-Sajjad, again, let's go to Ziyarat al-Warith. You want to know the caliber and the value of the genealogy and the nature and nurture of Imam as-Sajjad alayhi salam? Let's go to Ziyarat al-Warith. What does Ziyarat al-Warith say? It talks about his nature and nurture, but also his nafs. Remember, we've come to three, right? The three ends. We say, we testify to his nature and his nurture and his nafs. When we say, every Thursday in Ziyarat al-Warith, what do we say? وَأَشْهَدُ أَنَّ الْأَئِمَّةُ مِنْ وُلْدِكَ كَلِمَةُ التَّقْوَى. We say, I bear witness that the Imams, and who was the first Imam to come from Imam al-Husayn? We say, I bear witness that the Imams in your progeny, referring to Imam al-Husayn's progeny, are the word of Allah's consciousness, piety, God consciousness, which we said is the actual zina. We say Zainul Abidin. What does Zainul Abidin mean? The adornment of worship. We also then say, وَأَعْلَامُ الْحُدَى وَأُرْوَةُ الْوُثْقَى وَحُجَّةُ عَلَى أَهْلِ الدُّنْيَا. Ziyarat al-Warith, we recite, and those of the Imams that came through your progeny, Ya Imam al-Husayn, referring to Imam as-Sajjad, number one, we say they are the words of God consciousness. Then we also say that they are the signs of guidance and the safe handle of Islam and the decisive argument for mankind. My dear brothers and sisters, when we look at Imam as-Sajjad, you know, even his mother, we talked about Amir al-Mu'mineen, right? Yesterday. We said Amir al-Mu'mineen was so selective when it came to this nature and nurture. He selected Fatimah al-Zahra, salamullah alayha. He selected, and through her, what did he produce? Imam al-Hassan, Imam al-Hussein, Sayyidah Zainab, Kulthum. All of these people are the saviors of Karbala. Imam al-Hassan might not have been there, but wasn't Imam al-Hassan represented on the day of Ashura when we talked about Qasim? Imam al-Hussein was there. Sayyidah Zainab was there. Kulthum was there. Then when they selected al-Baneen, and again specifically for Karbala, Abul Fadl Abbas was there. Then when we look at Imam as-Sajjad, do you know who selected the mother of Imam as-Sajjad? It was none other than Amir al-Mu'mineen himself. Shahrbano, the mother of Imam as-Sajjad, the wife of Imam al-Hussein, was in fact a princess from Persia. She came to the Imam bound during the second Caliph's reign. He brought them as captives. When they were brought as captives in front of Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, you know what he said? If you have the hearts to listen to this and put it into context, he says, and let me relate the words to you. Imam says, daughters of royalty are not to be enslaved and sold on the open markets, so release them. I would say, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, do you realize you're talking about daughters of royalty of this world? And you're saying the statement about daughters of royalty are not to be bound and sold on the open market? You have this much regard for this worldly royalty, but the true princesses of heaven, your own daughters, are going to be bound one day and placed in the open markets? Amir al-Mu'mineen selected Shahrbano, through which Imam al-Sajjad came. Subhanallah, this mother came to Islam bound, and her son also is bound, but truly in essence free. It's this tree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this sacred tree that teaches us to overcome every type of slavery. It banned the slavery of the body and wants to liberate, even till today, the spirit and the slavery of the spirit to become truly free. My dear brothers and sisters, on the 13th day of Muharram, Imam Zainul Abidin, he broke out in the spiritual manner to come back. Remember I said when I started here 3 days ago, that the body of his father, Imam al-Hussein, laid bare for 3 days on the open lands of Karbala. Why 3 days? Because Imam al-Sajjad, they came from Kufa. Whilst they were physically imprisoned, they left. They came to the plains of Karbala and they saw Banu Asad, trying to figure out whose body was whose. Why? Because every single body had had its head separated from the body. And the real sad aspect is, there were people, it's not that there was only 72 companions. We say that there's only 72 companions that were with Imam al-Hussein. No, there were over 100 companions. The 72 only represents those heads that were cut and placed on spears. There were certain individuals that their tribes would not allow for their bodies and their heads to be separated. One of those, whose actual name means freedom, a free man, was none other than Hur. Hur ibn Yazid al-Riyahi. Hur, who was liberated and became a free man. We're talking about freedom. And liberated by who? 1 night's worth is all it took for this person to remove the shackles of the spirit and truly attain freedom. But his tribesmen came and said, you will not decapitate the body of Hur. He's from our tribe, and took the body away. But I ask you, my dear brothers and sisters, whose body is more worthy? Imam al-Hussein had no tribe to come and say, you will not do this to his body. Abul Fadl Abbas had nobody to come and say, you cannot separate the body, the head of this body. Look at the Mazlumiyah of Abu Abdullah Imam al-Hussein. Imam al-Sajjad arrives on the 13th of Muharram. He then identifies which bodies are Hashimi and which are non-Hashimi. He then takes the body of Abu Abdullah to a particular place and he finds an open grave. He then single-handedly, placing his hands under the back, remember the state of Abu Abdullah Imam al-Husayn's body trampled, picks up the body of Imam al-Husayn and takes it single-handedly to lay it into the ground. He places it into the ground and outlines for it. This is where the body of Imam al-Husayn is. Then he goes to his uncle Abul Fadl Abbas and does the same thing there. My dear brothers and sisters, it is in fact Imam al-Husayn's head that hadn't been placed into the body, with the body as yet. Why? Because the body was still in Kufa. The head had arrived into the palace of Ibn Ziyad. And this la'een, this accursed enemy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when the head of Abu Abdullah Imam al-Hussein is presented before him, he sits on his throne and with a rod in his hand, he plays with the lips and the teeth of Abu Abdullah Imam al-Hussein. And he sees Imam al-Sajjad standing there crying. He sees Sayyidah Zainab and the distress that this is causing them. And in this particular state, a man stands up by the name of Zayd ibn Arqam. He says, stop hitting these lips with your rod, for these are the very lips that I have seen with my own eyes that the Holy Prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has kissed. And then he broke into tears. Ziyad refers to him and says, Ibn Ziyad says to him, may Allah cause you to cry forever. And by Allah, if you weren't an old man, I would have killed you there and then. This individual, this Ziyad bin Arqam, he leaves and he goes out. And listen to the words that this person has to say. And this is the reality of what the whole point of today's lecture was. He says, O Kufans, he says, a slave is now a monarch, referring to Ibn Ziyad. He says, a slave is now a monarch ruling over you. And he's treating your property as his own. He says, O Arabs, henceforth you will all be slaves. Why? Because you have allowed the killing of the sons of Fatima al-Zahra. And you have given the authority to the son of Marjana, who killed the best of the inhabitants of this world. And you have permitted yourselves to be enslaved by him. So you only have one thing to look forward to: humiliation. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-aliyyil azim. Wa saya'lamu alladhina dhalamu ayya munqalabin yanqalibun. Wal 'aqibatu lil muttaqin. Let's raise our hands, brothers and sisters. Let us supplicate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we pray and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ya Allah, liberate us not only in the physical sense and allow us to achieve freedom, but in the truest sense, which is the spiritual freedom. We ask you, O Allah, to allow us to be able to control our nafs and perfect it. We ask you, O Allah, to allow us to live this life that is temporary in the truest sense of being truly free men. We ask you, O Allah, to allow us to be like Hur and truly be of those who are the companions of the Imam of our time, and become liberated to be of those who are ready to die on their feet rather than accept a life on their knees. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to save us from humiliation at the hands of anybody else. Hayhat min al-dhilla is the statement of Imam al-Hussein. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the awareness of ourselves so that we are able to direct ourselves to where He wants us to be. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to understand where we came from, where we are, and where we are going to, which is in essence back to Him. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive every single sin that we may have made in ignorance or being enslaved to our desires up until today. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us and allow us the tawfiq and the success not to go back to sinning ever again. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to liberate us from our desires. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to fully understand our potential which He's placed within us. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for the sake of Imam al-Sajjad, if there are anybody who is falsely imprisoned in the world today, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make their release forthcoming. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for the sake of Imam al-Sajjad, who was ill, that any of those from our near and dear ones or ourselves who are ill or sick, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them shifa and cure. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have mercy upon the marhumeen who are no longer with us. And we ask our final dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the reappearance of Imam al-Hujjah, ajrallahu ta'ala farajahu sharif, and allow us to be of his helpers and of His aids, and allow us to attain victory by allowing ourselves to be sacrificed in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجك. Ya Hussein. Let's have a loud Surah Al-Fatiha for the marhumin of Sayyid Ali Hadi Jafri, Ibn Sayyid Safdar Hassan Jafri, Sayyid Safdar Hassan Jafri, Sayyid Muhammad Hamid Jafri, Habiba Khatun Rizvi, and all the marhumin and marhumat. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdinas siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladhina an'amta 'alayhim ghayril maghdubi 'alayhim waladdallin. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Inna Allaha wa malaikatahu yusalluna 'alan nabi. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu sallu عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. Ya Hussein.